Alright, with Renaissance ideas spreading and with the Protestant Reformation overturning relatively stable societies and with shifting economic power, we need to look at how both of these phenomena affected society in the 16th century. So if you're ready to get them brain cows milked, let's get to it. Now in other videos we've talked about the rise of a new middle class and a merchant elite, but for the most part people in 16th century Europe understood their place in society based on social hierarchies that had existed for a long time. And essentially that hierarchy had three zones: class, religion, and gender. Now prior to this period, class was established at birth by one's wealth and family pedigree. Therefore, in the European construct, monarchs and nobility were at the top of the pile. But with the rise of the merchant elite, some of whom became very wealthy, class movement upward was a possibility. And this was a significant shift because not only was upper class rank determined by family pedigree, it was also connected to land ownership. And so, as the merchant elite began raking in piles of cash, it was a big deal that they were able to, in some cases, move into the upper class without owning land. But I should hasten to add that even in the shifting social hierarchies of the time, land ownership still held significant social capital. And then he said to me, he said, I've only got 4,000 acres of land. What's that accent? It's the worst accent I've ever done. For example, in the English Parliament, the upper house, the House of Lords, was reserved for the landed citizens, while the lower house, the House of Commons, was reserved for those bums without land, even if some of them were very wealthy. The point is, the prestige of land ownership was waning, but it still certainly had power. Now, in terms of religion and social hierarchy, it really mattered what you believed. Despite religiously tolerant places like Amsterdam and agreements like the Peace of Augsburg, which allowed princes in the Holy Roman Empire to decide their subjects' religion, religious persecution was still very much alive. For example, recall that in the French Wars of Religion, Catherine de' Medici had French Protestants slaughtered by the thousands in order to consolidate her power. And also, Jews were systematically persecuted and expelled from many countries so that they had to observe their religious practices in secret. So the point is, depending on the religious flavor of the society in which a person lived, what you believed could put you higher or lower in that society's social hierarchy. And finally, a person's place in the social hierarchy was affected by their gender. Basically, all European societies during this period were defined by patriarchy, which is to say a male-dominated society. In a patriarchal society, men have more rights, esteem, and opportunities than women do. In general, women were expected to submit to their husbands and fathers, and their earnings belonged to the men in their lives. Now, to be clear, this kind of rigid gendered structure existed mostly in the upper classes, especially in the nobility and the wealthy urban households. In rural households, men and women tended to be more equal, even though there were still separate spheres of work for both and certain roles that they each fulfilled. Even so, women were largely excluded from the economic and political life of Europe. However, with the ideas of the Renaissance and the Reformation spreading, questions of women's proper role in society came under scrutiny. In France, people began debating what was known as the querelle des femmes, which when being translated means the woman question. On one side of the debate, people argued that patriarchy was justified because women by nature were inferior to men, and they had philosophy and the Bible on their side. Philosophically, it was Aristotle who said that women were just unfinished men, like, God took women out of the oven a few minutes early. And people on this side of the debate also invoked the Bible by pointing out that in Genesis 3, it was Eve who was deceived by the serpent and thus plunged the entire human race into sin and separation from God. But on the other side of the debate were the practical people who said that the only reason women appear less competent than men is because they have been robbed of any opportunity for improvement by the patriarchal structure. After all, they argued, look at Elizabeth I of England. Last we checked, she was one of those undercooked men, and yet she ruled like a boss. Now, women's roles were also being debated in the church. In the Catholic Church, women could not be priests, but they could be nuns and join a convent, which gave them the opportunity to use their artistic, medical, or leadership gifts in the context of a community of women. Even so, Catholic women could hold no position of authority over a man. On the Protestant side, of course, vocations like monk and nun were abolished, so Luther and Calvin taught that women ought to be subservient to their husbands and put themselves on display as the model of obedience and charity because, after all, her husband's sandwiches ain't gonna make themselves. However, the Anabaptists gave women positions of authority, and some of them even became preachers. And out of all the Anabaptists who were martyred during this period, nearly a third of them were women in leadership. Okay, now during this period, with so many people moving from the country into the city, and with the larger challenge to religious authority happening because of the Reformation, city governments were left with the task of creating laws to regulate public morals, whereas before, that was the domain of the church. For example, some states passed secular laws restricting prostitution and begging. In Protestant states, clergy worked with local officials to get these laws passed because they believed that marriage was the only suitable outlet for male lust. Also, in some Protestant states, laws were passed to restrict the celebration of Carnival. This is a festival held right before Lent, which, according to the Catholic Church, church calendar was a season of repentance. During Carnival, people got drunk and danced like mad. And because it was motivated by the Catholic doctrine of penance during Lent, some Protestant leaders attempted to make laws restricting the excesses of Carnival. However, in more rural areas far from the reach of the state, people persisted in celebrating Carnival. Even so, in order to execute these laws, states had certain public punishments that they imposed to keep the population in order. If you broke one of these laws, you might find yourself, for example, in the stock. This is a contraption that bound your head, arms, and feet so that you couldn't move. It was usually done in a public area, and residents hurled rotten food and waste at the prisoner. Or if you broke these laws, you might find yourself in the middle of a CHARIVARI, which was a loud, clamorous parade whose goal was to publicly shame those who marched through town. But for those who did not find themselves in the stocks or the CHARIVARI, a new culture of leisure was on the rise. People had more free time thanks to the shifting nature of work and the economy, and thus, how do we fill up that time? One way was through blood sports, so titled because, you were gonna see blood. And some examples were boxing or jousting or like pitting animals together in contests like cockfights. And then Saints' Days festivals also drew huge crowds for celebrations. And All Saints' Day was a big one. It was a yearly festival on November 1st celebrating all the saints that had departed. And celebrations like this were officially sanctioned by the church, whereas celebrations like Carnival were not. Now, even with the spread of Renaissance ideals like humanism and the challenge to church authority in the Protestant Reformation, folk ideas continued to persist, and this was especially true in the witchcraft trials of the 16th and 17th centuries. For all that the Protestants and Catholics disagreed on, they agreed that witchcraft was the evidence of a pact with the devil and thus to be feared and extinguished. Now, scientific methods and principles are just around the historical corner at this point, but before those arrived, many in the church believed that sickness and natural disasters were the fault of witches doing the bidding of their Father below. So, during this period, a significant surge in witch trials and executions were carried out. And it's not hard to understand why. Catholics and Protestants were locked in a battle to the death to maintain influence and power in Europe, and if the witches were in league with the devil to overthrow Christianity, then they needed to be snuffed out. And so by some estimates during this period, 40 to 60,000 people were executed for witchcraft, the overwhelming majority of them being women. And there's a good reason for that one-sidedness. Recall that the general idea in a patriarchal society was that women were unfinished men, and thus they were weaker and lacked the moral fortitude of men. And that made women much easier targets for the influence of Satan because, they didn't have the strength to fight off his influence. And that's one explanation for the witchcraft craze, but another has to do with where these women were executed. About 3/4 of the executions occurred in the Holy Roman Empire. Remember, this is where the Protestant Reformation began, which caused a great deal of social upheaval. Not to mention they experienced the devastations of the 30 Years' War and thus could have been trying to regain some control over their lives by scapegoating women as witches. And with that, you should click right here to continue reviewing my videos for Unit 2. And you can click right here to get my AP Euro video note guides, which follow along with these videos and will help you get an A in your class. I'll catch you on the flip-flop. Heimler out.